Welcome everyone to today's program with Jerry Rodhe, talking about the Lentell map. My name is Katie, I'm the director at the Clark Museum, and just wanted to say thank you everyone for tuning in and joining us for our program today. It'll run about an hour long. We'll take a pause just in the middle of the presentation to answer any questions you might have. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will get to those. Throughout the program, you can put the questions in the chat box. You don't have to wait until the break. And we'll take some questions also at the end of the program. I think that is all I have to say. So I'll turn it over to Jerry to do his intro.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thanks, Katie. It's nice to see all you folks today virtually. And I'm happy to be back here at the Clark. Last time when I did a presentation, we were looking at an older version of this wonderful Lentell map, which is one of the real treasures of the Clark Museum. And in that program, we publicized the need for restoring the map. And sure enough, within just a few weeks' time, you folks generously donated enough money that we were able to have it rehabilitated. And so this will be your first chance to see the restored, improved version of the Lentell map, and it looks just great, and it's wonderful that we're able to preserve it this level, because it captures pretty much what it was like in 1915 when it appeared down in San Francisco at the Panama Pacific Exposition. And it's really a treasure for people who are interested in Humboldt County, and you'll find out in just a minute when I start zipping around here on the map. But it is 3D, and not only that, but the Lentell had colored in different types of vegetation or land use patterns, and he put in roads, railroad, trails, some of the communities, all of the main types of information you'd need to see what was in the county in about 1915. And today, we're going to have a lot of fun because we're going to go back to 1850 and work our way forward. We're going to look at what happened after the first whites came here in 1850, landed at Humboldt Bay and also up at Trinidad Bay, and started setting up their infrastructure, their roads and trails and bridges and ferries that would allow the merchants on Humboldt Bay and up at Trinidad to ship their goods to the inland gold mines on the Klamath and Trinity and Salmon rivers. And this was sort of the driving force that got Humboldt County populated and started in the early days and carried on for a number of years. So we'll go around to several locations today. I've got my handy pointer here, and I will be pointing out with my laser beam different locations as we go around. And remember, if you have questions, communicate in, and we'll try to answer them either at the break or at the end of the program. And I also encourage you to come in and view this in person, because until you've actually seen it up close, you can't tell quite how wonderful it is, but you'll get some idea today. Okay, so we're back in 1850, and they're already doing gold mining out here. And 8 men who were out on the North Fork of the Trinity River came west towards the coast. They were hoping to find a bay where ships could land, and there had been rumors that there was a bay here, but it wasn't on the maps. And they thought that if there was a landing place, merchants could get supplies and then send them on to the gold miners, because the gold mining was the really big thing in those first few years for activity, not only on the coast, but on these rivers inland. So by April 1850, several ships had landed. Several groups who had chartered these ships set up little communities. We'll look here on Humboldt Bay. There were actually 4 little towns started in 1850. One of them was right opposite the mouth of the bay, and they called it Humboldt City. And it was in a bad location because the current coming in from the bay tended to wash away the land there. And right in back of the coastline at the bay, there was a bunch of marshland and swampy areas that made it difficult for them to build a good pack train trail. They called their town Humboldt City, and it really lasted less than a year and then was abandoned, and eventually a lot of the land that it was built on washed away. And in the 1950s, it was rebuilt, and you'll now know that place as King Salmon. So you can, if you drive along the streets there and go, like, say, to Gills or some other location, you're actually going on the land that was one of the first white communities up here. In order to build that town, the original white party that came in there drove off the Weot Indians, who had a village at that site. They called it Chagashakarook, and the whites, as I said, drove them off, burned the village. They shot and killed 2 Weot Indian boys who had shown them how to get there, and it sort of started this 15-year reign of terror where the whites would oftentimes just shoot Indians on sight, or certainly shoot them if the Indians were in their way towards getting anything that they wanted. The second community was up at what's now the south end of Eureka. It was called Bucksport, and of course we know that kind of as a location, but for a while it was a real town. And if you ever go to a place like Seamus T-Bone or the McDonald's down there on Broadway, you're right in the heart of what old-time Bucksport used to be. And in those early days, it was separated from Eureka by a couple of miles that hadn't filled in yet. And it became more important when they put Fort Humboldt up on the cliffs up above the Bucksport area, and then it became kind of a supply area for the fort. Then the third community, of course, was Eureka, and in those days, it was right down at the waterfront. It was what we now know as Old Town, and there were really just, in those very early days, about 3 streets, what we now call First Street, Second, and Third, that had been cleared and populated. It turned out to be a very good location for a community because as you come in the bay, there are natural channels, and right when you get inside the 2 spits, one set of channels goes south to the south end of the bay, but another naturally occurring channel goes up north. It goes just next to Old Town Eureka, and eventually it peters out up towards Arcata. But in those early days, it was deep enough that a sailing vessel or a steam vessel could come in all of that way and not bump into anything, and actually load and unload lumber and supplies from the shoreline. So all they had to do down here at the waterfront of Eureka was build a small wharf just a little ways out in the bay, and the ships could come in and do their loading and unloading there. And then the fourth community on the bay was, in those days, it was called Union or Uniontown, and now has become Arcata. And it was a little harder to get to because they didn't have a channel that went all the way up there. But within a few years, they built what was called the Arcata Wharf that came out a couple of miles into the bay to where that channel was, and the ships could load and unload there. And then there was a fifth community that got started really early, and it wasn't on the bay, it was up here, Trinidad Bay, and they established the little town of Trinidad there. So when the whites first got here, they were just starting to develop the whole infrastructure for the state. In fact, when they arrived in April of 1850, California wasn't technically even a state yet, and you couldn't claim land. All that happened later in the year, and there was great confusion about who owned what property, who could claim what land. Of course, it was all Indian land to begin with, but now the whites just assumed that they could take over anything they wanted. And when they originally were setting out the government structures up in Northern California, they had one big county called Trinity County that went all the way from the coast, all the way up to the Oregon border, all the way down near where we have our county line today with Mendocino County, and then inland into almost to the Central Valley. And over the next few years, they divided things up. One of the first things they did was to divide Trinity County in two, a northern and a southern half. And the northern half up here where we have Del Norte County and northern Humboldt County became what they called Klamath County. And if you haven't heard of Klamath County, there's a good reason for that, because it hasn't existed since 1876. But back in the 1850s, it was an official governmental entity, and the first county seat for Klamath County was at Trinidad. That was the biggest town or city, not a city certainly, but the biggest community in the entire area north of the county line was at School Road in McKinleyville. So if you go up there at any time and you get to the first traffic signal if you're on Central Avenue, and you stop your car and then the light turns green and you drive north into McKinleyville, you've driven from Humboldt County into old Klamath County. So Klamath County was there for about 23 years. It was fading out in importance because most of the area in the county was gold mining areas, and by the late 1860s, the pace of mining gold had slowed considerably. There was just not as much activity there, not a lot of money. The county went into debt. Some years they didn't even claim any taxes. You can imagine how popular that would be today. Let's move to Klamath County and we won't have to pay taxes. Well, they found out right away that didn't work so well, because that meant they didn't have roads. They had a sheriff, but one year there were 18 murders committed in Klamath County, and the sheriff didn't apprehend anyone. He didn't find anybody that might have been guilty. Finally, he caught a guy, and they had a trial, and the fellow was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment in San Quentin. Well, you had to get him down to San Quentin from Klamath County. By that time, the county seat had moved and was up here, believe it or not, way up at Orleans, which is a real out-of-the-way place when we think of it today in terms of Humboldt County. But in those days, it was a hotbed of mining activity. So the sheriff has arrested this guy. He's been found guilty of murder, and the sheriff is supposed to take him down to San Quentin. They have to do it on horseback. So it's the sheriff and it's the prisoner. And they start out up in Orleans, up here, and they go down the Klamath River till get to Witchpeck, and then they start going up the Trinity River toward Willow Creek. And by the time they would have arrived in Willow Creek, some money has changed hands, and the prisoner is no longer with the sheriff. And the prisoner's never seen again, and neither is the sheriff, because he's been bribed to let this guy go, and so he just leaves, and now the county is not only without a sheriff, but they still have never sent anyone to prison for murder. So this is sort of the history of the place, and by the 1870s, poor old Orleans up here was fading very quickly. There had been pack train trails that went through there from Trinidad, I'll show you that in just a minute, that helped add to the importance of Orleans. But by the 1870s, it had the distinction of being the only county in the state of California that had no roads in it. If you wanted to get to Klamath County, you had to go by horseback or mule pack train. All there were trails, whether it's from the coast or from inland. And so there are reports of children being born in Orleans and living there for several years, and finally when they get old enough that their parents realize that they're going to be conscious of things and remember them, they would make a trip to the coast. And they'd get out to the coast, and the parents would point to something, and they would say, "That's called a road." And this is what a road looks like. And we don't have any in Orleans, and we don't have any in Klamath County, but someday we might have a road. Well, it turned out they never had a road while it was Klamath County. In fact, they never had a road into Orleans until 1913, if you can imagine that. They could go to Hoopa, they could even get to the Klamath River, but they had to build this last stretch of road. And the way they did it in those days was you had to go up the coast to Eureka, way up in the northern part of Humboldt County. And still today, there is a turnoff just north of Eureka called the Bald Hills Road. And that was this first road that took you to Orleans. And You can see here, we've gone up past Big Lagoon, Stone Lagoon, Freshwater Lagoon. Right about here on Redwood Creek is where Oric is. You go a couple of miles farther, and you can get on a paved county road that takes you onto this big long ridge above Redwood Creek. And the first thing you get to up at the top of the ridge is Ladybird Johnson Grove. Probably many of you have been there. And that's right on the old road. In fact, if you hike the Ladybird Johnson Trail, for about the first half mile, you're walking on the original road to Orleans. And you'll notice it's pretty wide for a trail, for a park trail. And the reason is it's on an old roadbed that had to be wide enough for these wagons. So that road went up onto the Bald Hills, and when they got out to a spot called Schoolhouse Peak, it's about 17 miles in from Highway 101, it made a turn and left the Bald Hills and dropped down to the Klamath River. And when it got to the Klamath River, there was a place to cross that started out as just a ferry crossing, but then by 1861, a man by the name of Martin spent his life savings to build a bridge across the Klamath River. And so here we are up on the Bald Hills, right here where there's this kind of little hump, right about where the redwoods end. The redwoods on this map are this kind of pinkish tan, and then grazing land, prairies are yellow, and Douglas fir forests are green. So you're up here kind of in the area where they did a lot of ranching. And then you would head down to the Klamath River, and you would get to a spot that they named for the fellow that had this bridge. His name was Martin. And he built the bridge, and he talked to the local Yurok Indians to ask them, well, how high does the water get in the winter when you have really heavy rains? And they told him, and they said, well, you know, we've known about this for centuries and centuries, and so we always put our villages high above the river so they wouldn't be taken out by flood. Well, so he builds his bridge 93 feet above the low water mark of the river, and that's quite a distance up to that. And it cost him something like $5,000, which was a lot of money in those times. He has the bridge in place for about 4 months. And then the heaviest flood in recorded history hit California. And not just California, the whole western United States. Out at Hoopa, where they had a measuring station, they measured 40 inches of rain one month, 30 inches another month, 20 another month. They had about 100 inches of rain by January, and then it kept raining after that. The rivers rose all over the place. And out here on the Klamath, up here at his bridge, it washed out the bridge, even though it was 93 feet above low water level. It even took out several of the Yurok villages that had been there for centuries and had never been hit. So poor Mr. Martin lost all his money. He couldn't afford to build another bridge. So instead, he was able to build a little ferry, and that was down then right near the river, and people could still cross there, and so they called it Martin's Ferry. And if you go out there today, that's what the place is called. And you now go on a new bridge that has withstood the floods, and it's called the Martin's Ferry Bridge. Well, before we lose track of all this, just to finish up with the 1861-1862 flood, it rained all over the western United States and even down into Mexico, and rained and rained and rained. And at its height, it turned the whole Central Valley into a very large lake, a 300-mile-long lake that ran through almost all of the Central Valley. It flooded Sacramento to the point that when Leland Stanford, who had just been elected governor, needed to go to the state capitol from the governor's mansion so he could be sworn in as governor, he had to take a rowboat. All of the streets were flooded so high that he could not go by horse and buggy or horseback, anything like that. The only way people could get anywhere around Sacramento was to take a boat. And it was that way throughout the Central Valley, all the way up towards Redding and all the way down just about to Bakersfield. And other places in the western part of the United States were similarly affected. So that's what happened out in Humboldt County. Other places suffered great damage, but the one real marker we have that we can keep fixed in our mind is the little community of Martin's Ferry that wouldn't be there and wouldn't be called Martin's Ferry if it hadn't been for that flood. It was such a big flood that it was even bigger than what people called the 1,000-year flood that we had in 1964, which is hard to imagine because that one was so destructive. But by all accounts, the 1861-62 flood was even bigger. Well, let me get back now for a moment so we can talk about the early roads and transportation, early communities that we had here. So we've named our 5 communities here along the coast, and their job is to have a good enough port where these ships can tie up and unload goods, and then they can be put on pack mules and taken as pack trains out to the mines. Well, probably the most interesting single pack train trail, maybe because it was kind of all by itself, is what they called the Trinidad Trail. And so, of course, it started here at Trinidad, and its objective was to get out onto the Klamath River and supply the miners in these places like Orleans and Witchpeck, and even on up farther into the Salmon River country, where it was really remote and you couldn't hope to get supplies anywhere else. So, if you wanted to supply those mines, and your ship landed here at Trinidad, you would make up your pack train, and this is the route that you would take to, let's say, get to Orleans. You'd start out in Trinidad, and if you look at this map here, we've got all these mountains going through Humboldt County. The mountains aren't really tall, they're seldom more than 5,000 feet in height, but they're really rugged. They're carved out of the landscape with these steep creeks and rivers that have just gouged things out, and then to get up between the different drainages, you have to climb really steeply, and sometimes the ridges are almost knife-edged to get over the top. So it's a real struggle to do that, and when you were having a pack train, you wanted to do is make it as easy on the mules as possible, so you try to avoid being down the river canyons any more than possible. You try to get up on the ridges and have your pack train go along a ridge route. So just to get up to the ridge, they started at Trinidad. They went north out past what's going to become Sumeg State Park. They are renaming Patrick's Point, and that will happen very soon. And you went north of there, and you got to Big Lagoon. That's kind of an obstacle. And instead of going around the east side of Big Lagoon, like our highway does today, like 101, they actually went up the spit between the ocean and the lagoon with their pack trains. And they went up to the north end of Big Lagoon, and just north of there, they climbed into the hills. If any of you have been up to the Azalea Reserve up there north of Big Lagoon, they went right up by that, got onto a ridge top. Here I'm showing the ridge, and they followed that ridge line for a little ways, and then they dropped off the ridge and went down to Redwood Creek. And the spot where they reached Redwood Creek is where the Tall Trees Grove is in Redwood National Park. And at that point, the mules could cross on a fallen redwood. It was a huge redwood. The packers said they measured it, and the size of the stump was 30 feet in diameter. So that makes it one of the all-time biggest redwoods that we know of. And by the way it had fallen into the creek, they could actually kind of build up a little approach, or a little ramp, and the mules could get on top of that log and walk across the creek on top of the log. Horses would have trouble doing that, but mules were really not only sure-footed, but really smart. And if there's anything wrong up ahead, the lead mule would stop. And like right in the middle of that tree, if there was something wrong at the other end, he'd know it. And instead of going any farther and getting into some kind of danger, like maybe the approach had washed out, he'd turn around and he'd just go back, and all the other mules would too. Horses, in situations like that, when they came to a landslide on the mountain, they'd keep going until they just fell off and rolled into the river. But the mules were completely different. I just have to tell you one little story about mules and how smart they are. If that doesn't convince you, here's an even better proof of that. They used to use the mules in mines, coal mines and gold mines, where they had to haul the ore out in little ore carts that ran on rails. And up in the coal country in the state of Washington, they would do this where they had a lot of coal mines, and the mines there supplied the coal for all of the railroads out west. And so they'd bring this mule in, and they'd turn the mule around so he was faced going out of the tunnel. And then they would hook up one of these ore carts to him, and it was filled with coal. And these were like little miniature rail cars, and they had the couplings like you have on a rail car. And so then they'd bring another car load of coal, and they'd smack it into the first one, and the coupling would click together like they do on train cars. And the mule would hear that. And then they'd bring another one, and he'd hear that, another click, and they'd do one more. That meant they had 4 cars now, and it was 3 clicks. And mule, that was fine with that. And normally that's what they do. They'd have the 4 cars together, and the mule was happy to take that out. But the mule would be listening, and he wasn't just listening, he was counting. And if they tried to sneak on a 5th car, and sometimes they did that, they'd move the car up, smack, he'd hear the click, and as soon as he heard click number 4, and he was counting, click number 4, he would just lie down on the tracks and refuse to move. You know, I've had students in school who had trouble counting up to 4, and here mules could just do it regularly. And let me tell you, I think if they had organized a mules union, they would have just caused the mining companies all sorts of problems. As it was, the miners came to respect them and realized that they couldn't, joke around with the mules, and they were going to be held accountable. Okay, so we're going to come back from Washington State now. We're still trying to get over to Orleans. We're up here on this ridge. We've gotten down to Redwood Creek at the Tall Trees Grove. They could go across on this big log. They'd go over onto the far side where the actual grove that they call the tall trees are, with redwoods that were 360 feet high. And then they'd go up the other side of the canyon, right about here. It would come out right where the prairie land started. See, on the map here, you can see where it's kind of golden yellow. That meant prairie lands. And you came out up there onto the first big prairie on the Bald Hills. And from there, there was a camp up there where the mule people could stay. It was permanently maintained. There was the prairie where the mules could graze overnight. There was a spring there, so there's a water supply. And then a couple of people had taken over the prairie, and they built a saloon there, of course, so that the mule packers also had something to keep them occupied. Now you have to remember, here we are on this prairie, and the mules are eating the food, and pretty soon some ranchers came up there and started grazing cattle. Well, for hundreds of thousands of years before that, those prairies had been filled with elk. And in fact, this first prairie that you got to was called Elk Prairie. And when the whites first saw it, they saw hundreds of elk grazing up there. First thing the whites did was shoot all the elk they could, because that was just free meat as far as they were concerned, and ship the elk meat over to the miners on the Klamath and Salmon River. But it was more than that to the people that had been there already, to the Cholula, Wilkut Indians, the Yurok Indians that inhabited that area. Elk, of course, was one of their mainstays for food, and the prairies were not just a place where elk would graze, but they had all sorts of valuable food products in and of themselves. They had edible bulbs, like from the brodea, that they could eat, the camas. I can still go up there today and hike, and in the summertime we will see the brodea flowers that are out there telling you there's an edible bulb beneath them. There was all sorts of shoots that would come up, certain grasses. There was a flower called the narrow-leaved mule ear that has a beautiful golden flower. And when that first came up, it was very tasty, and they'd harvest the stems and make a salad out of it. There were all sorts of game animals that were there besides the elk. They could hunt and for food. Deer, of course, especially on this part of the Bald Hills, it was elk because they wanted the sunny spaces, and the deer would stick more to the shaded side of the creek canyon. So there are these types of food available for the Indians, and what would happen is, say you were a Wilkut or Cholula Indian, as they're sometimes called up in the north. Well, in the wintertime, they would be down near Redwood Creek. Here, this blue line is Redwood Creek, and they would have permanent villages down there. And they would live close enough to the creek that when the salmon runs began, they could go down and harvest salmon from the creek. And they would have their redwood slab houses that were nice and tidy and warm, and that would allow them to live pretty comfortably in the rainy season in the winter. Then come late spring or summertime, they would leave those houses down by the creek, and this applied to other places like the Klamath River and like all the rivers in southern Humboldt. They'd leave their winter quarters with these permanent houses, and they'd go up into the prairie lands. And most of these prairies were a combination of grassland, and then next to them there'd be mixed oak woodland. There'd be canyon live oak in a few places, Oregon white oak, California black oak, and most importantly, tan oak, which isn't a true oak, but it puts out an acorn that was the favorite acorn that the Indians would eat. And they would, at different times, eat several of those different types of acorns. But this area up here in the Bald Hills and a lot of southern Humboldt and eastern Humboldt were just filled with tan oaks in the early days. And so they would gather those tan oaks and take them with them for winter usage. They would eat some of the food that they gathered in the summer up high, and then with these wonderful large baskets they could use for hauling, they'd bring down the seeds and nuts and other types of food for their winter quarters. So that's how it was until the whites got there. Now we're in the 1850s. The whites are up here on top of the Bald Hills. They found the Indian trails, and they've kind of improved them enough that they can have the pack train go through. They're going through these Indian people's homeland. It's like they're going through, if you were a white, it would be like someone coming to your vacation cabin and just marching through your yard and picking all the flowers. And if you had animals there of any kind, taking the animals. It was showing no understanding or respect or care for what had been this way of life that had existed for centuries. So pretty soon there was a reaction to that, and you had a series of combat incidents for years that took place up in the Bald Hills. I'll tell you a little more about that. We still got to get up to Orleans. So you got up here about 17 miles away from where Highway 101 is today near Orick, and you could take a trail down to the Klamath River, and it came out at this spot that I told you about, Martin's Ferry. You could cross the river there, go about 5 miles up the Klamath to the old Indian village of Witzpoos, which the name was changed to Witchpeck, and today, even today, it's a very significant spot for the Yurok tribe, and they have tribal offices there. There's still a ceremonial bay tree down near the river. They can conduct their dances. They can connect with their past, with the houses that had been there in the past. Some of the houses at Witchpeck had been there for hundreds of years that the Yurok people had. So you go from Witchpeck, you continue up the Klamath River, and you get to Orleans, which was a big mining area. There were side streams that came in there and allowed for flats that had gold-bearing ore in them. And the first miners could just mine the river and the side streams, just surface mining. After a few years, they'd taken all of the easily available gold, and then it became the hydraulic mining age, where they would actually bring water in from high up in the canyons and send it down through pipes maybe 1,000 feet drop at a time and have it power itself because of the force that was developed through these big iron nozzles that they called monitors. It was like a huge fire hose nozzle, and they'd blast away the hillsides there and get more of the ore that was embedded in the hillside. And for years they did that around Orleans and also near Witchpeck. So now you've got your pack train up there. It's maybe stopped at other places to deliver supplies, and some of the trains would go on up and leave Humboldt County about 5 miles north of Orleans and maybe go up the Salmon River or maybe continue on up the Klamath River to other mining spots. So that was one route that you could take in the early days. If you're down at Humboldt Bay, you could take different routes that the towns down there developed, and they were sometimes trying to get also to the Klamath River, but they were also, because they're farther south, they wanted to go over and get to communities in Trinity County on the Trinity River. So a couple of the main routes that were used, if you were at Uniontown, you would leave the town, Arcata today, and go east to Fickle Hill Road. Probably most people around here have driven up on Fickle Hill Road at least a little ways. Well, that was an old mining trail. And here we are at Union, and you get up on this ridge that I'm pointing to here. You'd leave the forest, and you would go out on Fickle Hill Road, drop down a little canyon, and bingo, you were up on Elk Prairie, where the little town of Elk is today. And right there you met another trail that came from Eureka. And the trail from Eureka went out around the east side of Humboldt Bay to Freshwater Corners, and then went up on Greenwood Heights Road, which is one of the main roads you can still take into the mountains, and continued on until it met the trail coming up from Fickle Hill, right up about a mile away from where the Neyland School is. And then from there, you could continue pretty much on the road that takes you nowadays out to Bridgeville. You go out, another 15 miles or so, and then head east through the Showers Pass area and get over to, I'm pointing here now into Trinity County, a little town of Hyampom, where the Hay Fork and the South Fork of the Trinity River meet, area right near where the big Monument Fire is burning right now. And so that was one of the major routes that you could take from Humboldt Bay to get you into Trinity County. If you wanted, and say you were at Bucksport now, or in Eureka for that matter, you could take a trail that went south. It crossed Elk River and crossed over the top of Humboldt Hill and kept going down past Humboldt Hill until they got to where the Humboldt Botanical Garden is. And right in the middle of the garden, there was a pack train route. In fact, I've been working with the people out there, and they've marked a section of the old trail in the middle of the Botanical Garden now. And you can see it's much wider than any of the other trails they have there. And then it kept going, and it went by Fortuna and Ronerville, places like that. And it came out by Hydesville, near Highway 36, and then it continued on up into the mountains from there, connecting sometimes with the other roads from Eureka, other trails from Eureka, and took you into Trinity County. So you had all of these different pack train routes that for a number of years were the only way that you'd get inland, and the only way you would get important things like the packers would take to these communities. So you might ask yourself, well, what was so important? What did they need inland? Well, they started growing some of their own crops. Out in Hoopa, for example, they grew enough wheat that they finally had a mill out there that could grind the grain so you could have wheat for bread, things like that. But a lot of times there was, the pack trains would be devoted to the highest priority item of all. Can anyone guess what that is? Easily transportable, kind of heavy. It was whiskey. If you had to get one thing to the miners that they didn't have, it was whiskey. And there was a report of one pack train that set out had 30 mules, so there'd be 30 different loads. And a mule could carry about 300 pounds. Each mule, that's pretty good, better than I could do by a long shot, but that's about what the average mule could carry. So each of these mules was loaded up with about 300 pounds of cargo, and they got to this mining community and unloaded, and so there were 30 loads. One load was completely filled with boxes of sugar. The other 29 mules was carrying whiskey, and that was their balanced diet that they brought out to the miners, and at least that load. So they also, those mules, and I'm really impressed with the mules, they could do all sorts of feats of strength and quickness and agility on these narrow trails. Sometimes they had a really heavy load, and they'd have to spread the load between two different mules so they could carry something that weighed even more. Or once in a while, they had a really special mule that maybe it would be like a mule on steroids, and they could carry an extra heavy load. And there's a report that one mule actually carried a pump organ for use in a church all the way into Orleans. Remember, Orleans had no roads in those days, and it had to go all the way on these narrow trails with a single mule doing it. My favorite story, though, is about a mule that had to take something up to Denny, which is just over the Humboldt County line in Trinity County. If you've ever gone out from Willow Creek and gone along the river by Salyer and Hawkins Bar and Burnt Ranch, if you were to take a county road off from there, you would go up the New River to this mining town of Denny. And in those days, just trails up there like to Orleans. And some family that had enough money, I guess, from their gold mining, wanted one of those cast iron bathtubs that would have been made in the 1880s. And so they built a special wooden frame that they put on this mule's back, and then they got this bathtub that weighed 300 or 400 pounds, took it, turned it upside down, and put it on that frame for the mule to carry. And the problem was that the tub went way down on the sides so far that the poor mule couldn't see where he was going. He could see the ground, but if he looked straight ahead, all he saw was the bathtub. So he's on this trail. They called it the New River Trail. I went right up New River here, and boy, was it a humdinger. It was carved out of the hillside. It was about 1,000 feet drop down into the New River, and the trail was really narrow. There weren't a lot of pullouts. There weren't a lot of places where you could make mistakes. That mule just kept on trucking up that trail. He got to where he was about 300 feet away from the house of the family that wanted the bathtub. And remember, he can't see anything except the trail. He's done a great job. Now he's in the yard of this family, and there's a tree there, and it's got a low overhanging limb. And he walks up, and the limb bumps him and knocks the bathtub off. So he didn't get to complete the trip, but by then they just hand carried it into the house. So another heroic story of the mules and what they could do back in those days. So you've got these different trail routes that went into the backcountry, and over time, a lot of those trails were replaced by roads. In the case of Orleans, it wasn't until 1913 that the first road went all the way to Orleans. And it turned out to be a road that was from Orick up along the Bald Hills and followed that old trail, went down by Martin's Ferry, and went up to Orleans on the pack train trail. So everyone's paying attention to this. It's a big deal. You know, this is the last town in the county that doesn't have a road. And so then it became a contest. Who would be the first person to drive a car into Orleans? And two groups of people got together, and they each got a car and brought it up as far as they could on the road, and they were going to try to be the first car into Orleans. So it's coming down to the wire now. They're building very close to Orleans, and they get up, and they finished a little bit of the road from Orleans going back towards the coast, and then they finished almost all of the road coming in from the coast, but there's this real rocky, difficult stretch to go through that's couple hundred yards wide. They haven't finished it. Meanwhile, the two cars are up there, and they each have a team of guys with them, and they're getting ready, and you figure you don't know how they're going to race up there because it's a narrow road. How will they ever compete for those last few hundred yards to get into town? Well, one team was very sneaky, and the night before they were scheduled to complete the road, they got up in the middle of the night and made sure that the other people were all asleep. And they walked over, they picked up their car. There's like 8 of these guys, and they were actually able to lift it up, and they hand carried the car across those 200 yards, got it on the far side of the construction site, and drove it into Orleans as the first car to be the winner. And there's a great photo of them the next day. They all look drunk and they all look happy, and they're leaning all over the car, and they were the winners. But they had to, I guess, probably they didn't have official rules, but it seems somehow they kind of cheated a little on that. Okay, so we've kind of done pack train trails except for southern Humboldt. Now, southern Humboldt County, if you went directly inland from there, you were out of the mining area. And so that meant that you didn't need to pack to these remote mining camps. You did need to pack into ranches that were down there and to the different communities. And guess what? Now you've got a new place where they're unloading the supplies for all of southern Humboldt County. Where do you think that was? You'd be hard-pressed to picture it now. It's way down here at Shelter Cove, just north of the county line, which actually is a seaport. And in those days, they had a wharf, and ships could come in and unload at the wharf. And they created a pack train trail that went from Shelter Cove inland. It went near Whitethorn. It went through Bryceland, and it came over, and it got to Garberville. And from Garberville, that wasn't even as far as they needed to go sometimes. So they would go way out in the backcountry to places like Harris and Alder Point and Bloxburg. And all of this was by mule. They would bring the supplies in all of that way. And then at certain times of the year, they would bring out things that the ranchers had for supplies. And one of the big things down in southern Humboldt was wool. They had great sheep ranches down there, really large ranches with many hundreds of sheep in a flock. And in the 1880s, the United States had an embargo on the importation of wool from other countries, like from Australia and New Zealand, where they would actually manufacture enough wool that they could send it out to other countries cheaper than what the local people could do with their wool, unless you had this tariff on it. And so they had a tariff that charged the importers enough money that it wasn't competitive for them to send in their wool compared to the wool growers in the United States. So for several years in the 1880s, if you were a sheep rancher, a wool grower out in places like Bloxburg or Harris, you could make a small fortune. And if you were careful with your money, you could pay off the mortgage on the land and build a nice new ranch house and be set up for life. But a lot of these people weren't very careful, and they just wanted to enjoy the good times really quickly. So here at Bloxburg, which was kind of the wool capital of southern Humboldt, and it turned out it was on one of the really early routes that went south into Mendocino County. There was a fellow in the 1880s who was going to walk across the country and write a book about it. And he started in Eureka for some reason. And by this summer of, I think it was 1885, he managed to make it out to Bloxburg on foot. And he's there in the middle of the day, and there's 3 or 4 saloons in town, and out front of every saloon, there's like a dozen or 2 dozen horses tied up. And he thought, wow, you know, this is the middle of the week, and what are all these people doing in town? What's going on? So he goes in one of the saloons, and there's 4 or 5 of these big round tables that they used to use for games of poker. And each of those tables is about 5 guys sitting at the table. And they have this unusual place setting. They don't have knives and forks, but what they have they have a stack of $25 gold pieces, which were their playing chips. So the smallest you could bet at a time was $25, and in those days that was a lot of money. That's one part of their setting. They have a glass of whiskey over by their left hand, and by their right hand, laying flat on the table, is a revolver. And that's all the things they needed to enjoy their game of poker. And so this outsider is walking through. He watches. He's just utterly fascinated. They're playing poker, and sometimes they just shove an entire stack of gold pieces into the center of the table. So now we're talking maybe $300. Today that would be thousands of dollars at a time that they're putting in there. And they just keep gambling away, and finally they need to take a break. And when they do, there's one guy still at the table, and so our traveler friend goes over and introduces himself, and he's trying to figure out, what's going on. And he says, well, who are you people, or how are you able to do this? And the guy that's there said, well, we're sheep ranchers, but our real business is gambling and getting drunk, and we do it every day. And because they were making enough money without them even being there, that they could afford to do that. And apparently they did that day after day, year after year, until in the mid-1890s, the government dropped the tariff on wool. And all of a sudden, New Zealand wool and Australian wool could come in and could compete with the wool here. And to round things out for a perfect storm of disaster events, that same year, they had a terrifically hard winter that killed off many of the sheep. A lot of the sheep ranchers lost more than half their flock. And if they'd been the ones who were in there gambling every day, turned out they lost their places because they hadn't paid off their mortgages. They hadn't tidied away anything for improvement on the ranch, and they were just out of luck. A few of the ranchers who'd been a little more cautious were able to weather out that storm and kept going and wound up with even bigger ranches than before. But for a number of those people, they had 5 or 6 or 7 glorious years of gambling every day, and then they went to the poorhouse. So that was our trail system that you had down here in southern Humboldt County. We're getting a little close. Should I stop now, you think? Or?
You might want to wrap it up. We don't have any questions.
Okay.
So.
I'll go on a few more minutes, a couple more minutes. Okay. So we've covered the trails in Humboldt County to some extent now, at least the major ones that we had in the old days. This sets us up, maybe someday in the future, we'll do a program where we'll start talking about the highways and the railroad that went through. Just to whet your appetite, I'll tell you one thing that we have to look forward to, which is the construction of a railroad that went out of Humboldt County and connected Humboldt County with the rest of the United States. In the early 1910s, Humboldt County was the only city in the United States that didn't have railroad access to the outer world. It's kind of like Orleans not having a road to it until 1913. So by the mid-1910s, well, by 1914 actually, the railroad had been planned and had been constructed so that you could have rail cars from the Humboldt Bay area go all the way south to San Francisco Bay, to Sausalito, where the rail line ended, and then by ferry connect to San Francisco. And building that rail line was a tremendous feat of engineering, and also involved a lot of maneuvering by the different groups that wanted a hand in owning that railroad. And to let you know what that entailed, in the early 1900s, 10 to 15 years before the rail line was finally built, both the Santa Fe Railroad and the Southern Pacific Railroad, which were the two big rail companies in California, each wanted to have their own separate rail line from Eureka to Sausalito. And they sent their engineers out to plan the best course. And down here in Humboldt County, they agreed, both sets of engineers thought, well, we got to go over to the Eel River, we've got to go up the Eel River. But when they got to the South Fork of the Eel, down here where the old town of Dyerville used to be and where you're in Humboldt Redwood State Park. Then they diverged, and the engineers for the Southern Pacific did a survey up the main Eel River. Here went through Fort Seward and Alder Point and out into Mendocino County. The Santa Fe engineers went up the South Fork of the Eel, where the highway eventually went. So they went through Wyatt and Phillipsville and Miranda and Garberville, or near Garberville, those kind of places. So they each had their surveys, their plans for what they do. And for a while it looked like both of these rail companies at tremendous expense would build separate rail lines to connect this fairly small city with the rest of California. And so when we do another program in the future, we will tell you the rest of that story about how they finally agreed to work things out and how we came to have the Northwestern Pacific Railroad a few years later. So I think that's it for now. I want to thank everyone who's watching, and if any of you contributed to the restoration of the map, a special thanks to you, because it's just wonderful to look at now. And let me tell you, for me and other people that love Humboldt County history, it's one of the great treasures that we have. And I hope you'll come into the Clark soon and take a look at it and study some of the places we've looked at today, and maybe come up with some questions for me next time we do a program. So thanks.
All right, so I didn't see any questions in the chat box. So if anyone does have questions that come up afterwards, you can just email me. I sent out the link earlier, so you can always email me. I'll send them to Jerry, and we can get an answer.
Yeah, I'll be happy to get back in touch then. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
We'll see you next time.
Okay, bye.